On a cold December day in 2020, 4-year-old Serenity McKinney was seen by family members during a holiday gathering in Kentucky. She was small, quiet, and familiar to the people around her, a child who belonged there, a child no one thought they would never see again. After that day, Serenity was never publicly seen again. Weeks passed, then months. There were no Amber Alerts, no frantic searches flooding the streets, no urgent headlines asking where Serenity McKinney was. Life, for most people, went on. But behind closed doors, questions began to grow. Family members started asking the same thing again and again. Where is Serenity? And each time, the answers were vague. She was fine. She was with her mother. She was being taken care of. Then, more than a year later, something changed. In January 2022, Serenity McKinney's extended family contacted authorities and officially reported her missing. The report would immediately raise red flags, not just because a child was missing, but because she had last been seen over a year earlier, in December 2020. In Shelbyville, Kentucky, police were suddenly faced with a chilling reality. A 4-year-old child had seemingly vanished in plain sight, and no one had called for help. As investigators began asking questions, attention quickly turned to the people closest to Serenity: her mother, Catherine Abby McKinney, and Abby's boyfriend, Dakota Hugh Hill. What detectives would soon uncover was not a story of a runaway child or a misunderstanding. It was something far darker. In February 2022, the search for Serenity McKinney would end in the most devastating way imaginable, when human remains were discovered in a wooded area near the Bullitt, Jefferson County line in Kentucky. The remains were found inside a suitcase, wrapped in plastic. Authorities would later confirm what no family should ever have to hear: the remains belonged to Serenity McKinney. As the investigation unfolded, disturbing details emerged, evidence that pointed not only to Serenity's death, but to what happened afterward. What followed were arrests, courtrooms filled with grief, and guilty pleas that forced the public to confront how a child could disappear for over a year without anyone stepping in. This is not just the story of Serenity McKinney. It is the story of what happens when warning signs are missed, when silence replaces action, and when the people meant to protect a child become the center of a homicide investigation. Before we go deeper, take a moment to support this channel. Like this video, leave a comment with where you're watching from, and subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories for in-depth, carefully researched true crime documentaries. Because every child deserves to be seen, and every story deserves to be told. Serenity McKinney was 4 years old. Her full name was Serenity Ann McKinney, sometimes reported as Serenity Ann McKinney, a small child with soft features, bright eyes, and a presence that family members later described as gentle and quiet. She was not a loud child. She did not demand attention, and that, some would later say, made it easier for her absence to go unnoticed for far too long. Serenity was born into a complicated family situation. Her father, David Roller, did not have full custody of her. According to statements later made in court, he believed his daughter was being cared for by her mother, Catherine Abby McKinney, and by the adults around her. He believed Serenity was alive. He believed she was safe. Other family members believed the same. During the holidays in December 2020, Serenity McKinney was seen by relatives at a family gathering. This was the last confirmed time she was publicly seen alive. Family members later told investigators that Serenity appeared quiet, but nothing about that day immediately signaled danger. There were no visible emergency calls, no police involvement, no missing posters. To everyone present, Serenity was simply a child spending time with family during the holidays. That assumption, that Serenity was safe because she was with family, would become one of the most haunting aspects of this case. After that December gathering, Serenity faded from view. There were no photographs of her after that point, no videos, no sightings by extended relatives, no appearances at public places. When family members asked about Serenity, they were told she was fine, that she was with her mother, that she was being taken care of. And for a time, those explanations were accepted. In families where children move between adults, gaps in communication are sometimes normalized. Serenity did not attend school. There were no mandatory reporters seeing her every day. There was no official system tracking her presence or absence. And so, Serenity McKinney slipped quietly into silence. Behind that silence was a child completely dependent on the adults around her, especially her mother, Catherine Abby McKinney, who was responsible for her care during that period. Abby was in a relationship with Dakota Hugh Hill, a man who would later become central to this case. At the time, no one outside the immediate circle suspected what was happening inside. Months passed, then more months. Eventually, concern turned into fear. Extended family members began realizing that no one had physically seen Serenity in a very long time. Conversations that once ended with reassurance began ending with confusion, and confusion slowly became alarm. By January 2022, more than a year after Serenity McKinney was last seen, her extended family could no longer accept the explanations they had been given. That was when authorities were finally contacted. That was when Serenity McKinney was officially reported missing. And that single phone call would unravel a story far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. Because by the time police began asking where Serenity was, Serenity had already been gone for a very long time. After the holidays of December 2020, Serenity McKinney disappeared from public view. There was no single moment that triggered alarm, no frantic phone call, no report to police, no search parties combing the streets of Shelbyville, Kentucky. Instead, Serenity McKinney faded out quietly. Family members later told investigators that after the December holiday gathering, they simply stopped seeing her. There were no new photos, no visits, no updates that could be verified in person. But when questions were asked, explanations were given. Serenity was said to be with her mother, Catherine Abby McKinney. She was said to be fine. She was said to be taken care of. And for a time, those explanations were accepted. Serenity did not attend school. She was not enrolled in daycare. There were no teachers or caregivers required by law to report her absence. There was no routine schedule that would expose the fact that she was missing. In situations like this, silence can masquerade as normalcy. Weeks passed, then months. As time went on, family members began noticing something unsettling, not just that Serenity wasn't around, but that no one could say exactly when they had last seen her. Conversations became circular, questions went unanswered, the reassurances began to feel hollow.
By late 2021, concern had hardened into fear. Extended relatives realized they had not physically seen Serenity McKinney in over a year. They did not know where she was sleeping. They did not know who was caring for her. They did not know if she was alive. In January 2022, the silence finally broke. Serenity McKinney was officially reported missing by extended family members. Law enforcement in Kentucky opened a missing child investigation, and almost immediately, the timeline raised red flags. The last confirmed sighting of Serenity McKinney dated back to December 2020. That meant more than 12 months had passed before authorities were notified. For investigators, that delay changed everything. Evidence that might have been preserved was now potentially gone. Memories had faded, digital records had aged, surveillance footage from businesses and neighborhoods had long been overwritten. Potential witnesses no longer remembered specific dates or details. This was no longer a fresh missing child case. It was a cold start. As police began reconstructing Serenity's final months, they focused on the people who had last been responsible for her care: Catherine Abby McKinney and Abby's boyfriend, Dakota Hugh Hill. Investigators conducted interviews, comparing statements against timelines, phone records, and known movements. The more questions they asked, the more inconsistencies appeared. And as word spread that a 4-year-old girl had been missing for over a year without anyone reporting it, the community reaction was immediate. Shock turned into outrage. People in Shelby County and beyond struggled to understand how a child could vanish for so long without intervention. Candlelight vigils were organized. Serenity's name began appearing in headlines and social media posts across Kentucky. How does this happen? Where was the system? Who failed this child? Police publicly acknowledged the difficulty of the case, emphasizing that the delayed report had significantly complicated the investigation. Still, they pressed forward, following every lead they could develop, even those that arrived too late. Because by that point, investigators were no longer just searching for a missing child. They were preparing for the possibility that Serenity McKinney was never coming home. And just weeks after the missing person report was filed, that fear would be confirmed, in a way that would devastate Serenity's family and change the case forever. Once Serenity McKinney was officially reported missing in January 2022, everything moved quickly, but under the weight of time already lost. Law enforcement initiated standard missing child protocols, despite the unusual timeline. Detectives began by retracing Serenity's last known movements, attempting to rebuild a year of her life from fragments of memory and conflicting statements. Interviews were conducted with family members, friends, and anyone who might have seen Serenity after December 2020. Officers compared stories, dates, and explanations. They asked the same questions repeatedly, not to intimidate, but to expose inconsistencies that often emerge when timelines are false or incomplete. At the same time, Serenity's family turned outward. Photos of the 4-year-old began circulating across social media. Flyers bearing her name and face were shared across Kentucky and beyond. Candlelight vigils were organized as relatives and community members gathered to pray, mourn, and demand answers. For many in attendance, this was the first time they had ever heard Serenity McKinney's name, and that realization alone was devastating. Local news outlets quickly picked up the story. Headlines emphasized the most disturbing detail, that Serenity had been missing for over a year before anyone contacted police. Within days, national outlets followed, and Serenity's case spread across television broadcasts, online news platforms, and true crime communities.
The public reaction was immediate and emotional. How could a 4-year-old disappear for more than 12 months without anyone noticing? How could no agency intervene? How could no alarm be raised? As attention grew, tips began to come in. Some were vague, some were outdated, some led nowhere. Investigators followed every credible lead anyway, fully aware that time had already erased much of what they needed. Phone records were reviewed, locations tied to Catherine Abby McKinney and Dakota Hugh Hill were examined, digital data was analyzed where possible, witness statements were cross-checked against known movements. But the longer detectives worked the case, the clearer one truth became. Serenity McKinney had not simply wandered away. The focus of the investigation narrowed. Publicly, police remained careful with their language, stating only that the case was active and ongoing. Privately, the direction of the investigation was becoming clearer with every interview. For Serenity's family, the search was agonizing. Her father, David Roller, faced the unbearable reality that the child he believed was alive might already be gone. Extended family members attended vigils carrying photos of a little girl they had trusted others to protect. Grief mixed with guilt, hope collided with dread. Community members, many of whom had never met Serenity, showed up anyway. Candles were lit, prayers were spoken. Strangers embraced her relatives, offering comfort and outrage in equal measure. And always the same question lingered in the air. Where is Serenity McKinney? As the investigation intensified, authorities urged anyone with information to come forward, no matter how small it might seem. If you know anything about the disappearance of Serenity McKinney, contact local law enforcement immediately. That call would prove critical, because not long after the search began, not long after the vigils and the headlines and the public pressure, investigators made a discovery that would end the search for Serenity McKinney and begin a homicide investigation that would shock Kentucky to its core. In February 2022, just weeks after Serenity McKinney was officially reported missing, the search took a devastating turn. Authorities announced that human remains had been discovered in a wooded area near the Bullitt Jefferson County line in Kentucky. The location was remote, quiet, and far from the candlelight vigils and flyers that had begun circulating Serenity's face across the state. Police quickly secured the area. Yellow tape stretched between trees. Investigators moved carefully through the brush. The scene was treated not as a missing person search, but as a potential crime scene. The remains had been found inside a suitcase wrapped in plastic. From the beginning, investigators were cautious with their language. They confirmed only that the remains were believed to belong to a child. No names were released immediately. No assumptions were stated publicly. But behind the scenes, the weight of what had been found was already settling in. For Serenity McKinney's family, the news was terrifying. Hope, however fragile, still existed until that moment. Even after more than a year, some family members had clung to the possibility that Serenity might be alive somewhere, unseen but breathing. That hope ended in those woods. After forensic testing and identification procedures were completed, authorities confirmed what no one wanted to hear. The remains were those of 4-year-old Serenity McKinney. The announcement sent shockwaves through Kentucky. The child who had been missing for more than a year had not simply vanished. She had been hidden, placed inside a suitcase, left alone in the woods. The grief was immediate and overwhelming. Family members collapsed in tears. Vigils turned into memorials. Candles were lit not in hope, but in mourning. The small face on missing person flyers was now the face of a child whose life had been stolen. Serenity's father, David Roller, was confronted with a reality no parent should ever face. confirmation that his daughter was gone and that she had suffered in ways that would soon be revealed in court. The community response was raw. People who had never met Serenity McKinney felt as though they had lost her too. Parents hugged their children tighter. Questions turned into anger. How could this happen? How could a child be gone for so long with intervention? As police continued processing the scene, the investigation shifted fully into a homicide case. Attention returned immediately to the adults responsible for Serenity's care, Catherine Abby McKinney and Dakota Hugh Hill. Investigators now had physical evidence, a location, a reality they could no longer ignore. The suitcase in the woods was not just a discovery. It was proof that Serenity McKinney had not been forgotten by accident, she had been deliberately concealed. And with that confirmation, the case entered its most consequential phase. Because the question was no longer where Serenity was. The question was who was responsible, and what they would say now that the truth could no longer stay hidden. With the discovery of Serenity McKinney's remains, the investigation entered a new and irreversible phase. This was no longer a missing child case. It was now a homicide investigation. Within days, law enforcement publicly identified the two people at the center of the case, Catherine Abby McKinney, Serenity's mother, and Abby's boyfriend, Dakota Hugh Hill. Investigators had spent weeks conducting interviews, comparing statements, and analyzing evidence gathered after the missing person report was filed. Once Serenity's remains were found, those efforts accelerated. Police began assembling probable cause, the legal threshold required to make an arrest. That probable cause came from multiple sources, inconsistencies in statements, timelines that did not align, and physical evidence connected to the location where Serenity McKinney was found.
Authorities have stated publicly that the evidence indicated Serenity's death was not accidental and that steps had been taken to conceal her body. On that basis, arrests were made. In February 2022, Catherine Abby McKinney and Dakota Hugh Hill were taken into custody. The charges were severe. Dakota Hugh Hill was charged with murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with physical evidence. Prosecutors alleged that he was directly responsible for Serenity McKinney's death and for the actions taken afterward. Catherine Abby McKinney was charged with complicity to murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with physical evidence. Authorities alleged that Serenity's own mother played a role not only in what happened to her daughter, but in concealing the crime. The arrests sent shockwaves through the community. For many, the most devastating detail was not just the brutality of the crime, it was the reality that Serenity McKinney had been betrayed by the very people meant to protect her. Both defendants were booked into jail as the charges were announced publicly. Mugshots circulated quickly across news outlets and social media, drawing an outpouring of anger, grief, and disbelief. During initial court appearances, prosecutors outlined the seriousness of the allegations and emphasized the risk to the community. Given the nature of the charges, bond conditions were strict. The court made clear that this case would move forward under the weight of overwhelming public scrutiny. For Serenity's family, the arrests brought conflicting emotions. There was relief that someone was being held accountable. There was anguish knowing who those people were. And there was the crushing realization that no court proceeding could ever undo what had been done. As the legal process began, authorities reminded the public that these were allegations, that guilt would ultimately be determined in court. But the direction of the case was now clear. The investigation had identified its suspects. The evidence had crossed a threshold. And Serenity McKinney's name would soon be spoken not just at vigils, but in courtrooms. What followed would be a long legal battle, one that would force every detail of Serenity's short life and tragic death into the public record, and it would culminate in courtroom moments that would leave no one unchanged. After the arrests of Catherine Abby McKinney and Dakota Hugh Hill, investigators were finally able to speak publicly about what the forensic examination had revealed. The Bullitt County medical examiner conducted an autopsy on the remains recovered from the wooded area near the Bullitt-Jefferson County line. The findings, while carefully worded, painted a deeply troubling picture of what Serenity McKinney endured. Serenity had been found inside a suitcase, wrapped in plastic. That fact alone carried enormous forensic significance. According to investigators, the way her body was concealed indicated deliberate human action, not an accident, not neglect, but intentional effort to hide her remains. The autopsy further revealed that Serenity McKinney had suffered fractures to her right wrist and right leg. Medical examiners did not publicly specify when those injuries occurred or the exact mechanism that caused them. What they did state was that the injuries were significant and concerning, particularly given Serenity's age. The coroner was unable to determine a precise medical cause of death, but that did not mean Serenity's death was unexplained. In forensic terms, when a death is ruled consistent with homicide, it means the totality of evidence does not support natural causes, accident, or self-inflicted harm. Instead, the circumstances, injuries, and manner in which the body was treated point to the involvement of another person.
In Serenity McKinney's case, investigators emphasized several critical factors: the presence of traumatic injuries, the concealment of her body, the location where she was found, and the absence of any evidence suggesting an accidental death. Taken together, the medical examiner concluded that Serenity's death was not accidental. That conclusion transformed the case legally and emotionally. For Serenity's family, the autopsy results confirmed what many already feared, that Serenity had suffered and that her death had been followed by an attempt to erase her existence. Her father, David Roller, would later speak in court about the weight of learning those details, the unbearable knowledge that his daughter's last chapter had been marked by pain and betrayal. For the public, the findings intensified outrage. The idea that a 4-year-old child could be injured, hidden inside a suitcase, and left undiscovered for over a year struck a nerve far beyond Kentucky. Serenity McKinney's name became a symbol of how easily vulnerable children can fall through the cracks when no one intervenes. And yet, even with the autopsy findings, many questions remained unanswered. When exactly did Serenity die? What led to her injuries? Who was present in her final moments? Those answers would not come from the medical examiner alone. They would come from courtrooms, plea negotiations, and the words of the people charged with her death. Before we continue, if you're finding this episode important, take a moment to support this work. Like the video, leave a comment with where you're watching from, and subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories. Your support helps keep cases like Serenity McKinney's from fading into silence. Because what happened to Serenity McKinney should never be forgotten, and the legal reckoning was far from over. As the case moved forward, the focus shifted from investigation to accountability. What happened next unfolded inside a Kentucky courtroom, where the truth of what happened to Serenity McKinney would no longer be debated in headlines, but formally acknowledged under oath. Months after their arrests, both defendants made decisions that would change the direction of the case forever. First came Catherine Abby McKinney. Serenity's mother ultimately entered a guilty plea to multiple charges, including manslaughter, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with physical evidence. In doing so, Abby McKinney admitted criminal responsibility in the events surrounding her daughter's death and in what happened after. Her plea meant that prosecutors no longer had to prove her guilt at trial, but it also meant something else. Abby McKinney was not pleading guilty to murder. Legally, the difference matters. A murder charge requires prosecutors to prove intent, that the defendant knowingly and deliberately caused a death. A manslaughter plea, by contrast, acknowledges criminal responsibility for a death without the burden of proving premeditated intent. In plea negotiations, this distinction is often central. For prosecutors, a manslaughter plea can guarantee a conviction and spare a family the trauma of a lengthy trial. For defendants, it reduces potential sentencing exposure and removes the risk of a jury conviction on more severe charges. In this case, the plea ensured that Serenity McKinney's death would be legally acknowledged, without forcing her family to relive every detail in open court. Then came Dakota Hugh Hill. Unlike Abby McKinney, Hill pleaded guilty to murder, along with abuse of a corpse and tampering with physical evidence. His plea formally accepted responsibility for Serenity McKinney's death and for the actions taken to conceal her body. With that plea, the most serious question in the case was answered. The court no longer needed to determine whether Serenity had been killed, only how justice would be delivered. Prosecutors spoke publicly about the pleas, emphasizing that while no outcome could ever bring Serenity back, the admissions ensured accountability and spared the family from enduring a trial that would revisit their worst loss in painful detail. Inside the courtroom, the emotional weight was unmistakable. Members of Serenity's family listened as the charges were read, the pleas entered, and the facts summarized. For David Roller, Serenity's father, the moment was both devastating and final. Confirmation, spoken aloud, of what had been done to his daughter. Family members expressed grief, anger, and heartbreak. Some statements reflected sorrow that justice had taken so long. Others focused on the irreversible damage done, not just to Serenity, but to everyone who loved her. The pleas closed the door on speculation. There would be no jury deliberation, no competing narratives, no unanswered legal question about responsibility. Instead, the courtroom became a place of reckoning. What followed would be sentencing,
a moment when the law would determine how much time could ever be considered equal to the life of a 4-year-old child. And for Serenity McKinney's family, it would be the moment when words finally gave way to consequences. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy. There was no jury to persuade, no verdict left to announce, only consequences. The first sentence handed down was for Dakota Hugh Hill. After pleading guilty to murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with physical evidence, Hill stood before the judge as the court outlined the severity of his actions. Prosecutors emphasized that Serenity McKinney was 4 years old, a child entirely dependent on the adults around her, and that her death was followed by deliberate efforts to conceal what had been done. The judge spoke about the gravity of the crime, the vulnerability of the victim, and the lasting harm caused not only to Serenity McKinney, but to her family and the community. Dakota Hugh Hill was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The number itself landed hard. 5 decades. For many in the courtroom, it was the longest sentence they would ever hear tied to a child's name. Before sentencing was finalized, Hill addressed the court. According to reports, he offered a brief apology, words that acknowledged Serenity McKinney and her family. The statement was short, restrained, and did little to ease the pain felt by those listening. For Serenity's family, no apology could undo what had already happened. Then came the sentencing of Catherine Abby McKinney. Serenity's mother had pleaded guilty to manslaughter, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with physical evidence. Prosecutors reiterated that while Abby McKinney did not plead guilty to murder, her actions and inactions played a critical role in her daughter's death and in the concealment that followed. The court acknowledged the complexity of sentencing a parent for crimes involving their own child, but the judge made clear that parenthood did not lessen responsibility. It heightened it. Abby McKinney was sentenced to 12 years in prison. As the sentence was read aloud, emotion rippled through the courtroom. For Serenity McKinney's family, particularly her father, David Roller, the moment carried conflicting weight. There was relief that the case had reached a conclusion. There was acknowledgement that accountability had been imposed. And there was heartbreak. Because no sentence, no matter how long, could measure the value of a 4-year-old life. Family members later spoke about the pain of hearing the sentences, about the permanent absence Serenity left behind, and about the years that had been stolen from her before she ever had the chance to grow up. Outside the courtroom, the public reaction was swift. Some felt the sentences reflected justice. Others questioned whether any punishment could ever be enough. But one truth was undeniable. The legal system had spoken.
Dakota Hugh Hill would spend decades behind bars. Catherine Abby McKinney would serve years for her role. And Serenity McKinney's name would no longer be tied to uncertainty or unanswered questions, but to a record that confirmed what happened to her and who was held responsible. Still, even with sentencing complete, the case left behind deeper questions about oversight, missed warnings, and how a child could disappear for so long without protection. Those questions would not be answered in court. They would be left to the public and to the systems meant to protect children to confront.
When the courtroom doors closed and the sentences were handed down, the legal case ended. But for Serenity McKinney's family, the real aftermath was only beginning. In the days surrounding sentencing, the public finally heard directly from those who had carried the weight of this loss from the very start, especially Serenity's father, David Roller. Inside the courtroom, David Roller addressed Catherine Abby McKinney, the woman who had given birth to Serenity and who now stood convicted in connection with her death. His words, as reported, were raw and unfiltered, a father confronting a truth no parent should ever have to face. He spoke about the life Serenity never got to live, about birthdays that would never come, about the trust that had been broken beyond repair. There was no anger theatrics, no shouting, only grief, heavy, direct, and devastating. Family members echoed that pain, expressing sorrow not just for Serenity's death, but for the months and years she was gone without anyone stepping in to protect her. Several relatives publicly questioned how a child could disappear for so long without intervention, a question that resonated far beyond the courtroom. Outside, the community responded. In Shelby County, vigils turned into permanent memorials. Candles, stuffed animals, handwritten notes, and flowers appeared in public spaces, quiet reminders of a child many had never met but now mourned collectively. Neighbors gathered in silence, strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, parents held their children close. The name Serenity McKinney was spoken aloud again and again, not as a headline, but as a person,
Local advocacy groups and child welfare supporters joined the conversation, calling for systemic change. They spoke about the gaps that allow vulnerable children to fall out of sight, especially those not enrolled in school or daycare, those whose lives exist mostly behind closed doors. Some called for stronger reporting requirements. Others demanded better coordination between agencies. Many asked the same question in different ways. How do we make sure this never happens again? The grief was not quiet, but it was respectful. Community leaders urged people to remember Serenity with dignity, to avoid speculation, and to honor her life rather than sensationalize her death. Media outlets echoed those calls, asking viewers to approach the case with compassion. For Serenity's family, healing was and remains a long, uncertain road. There was no sense of closure, only acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of loss, acknowledgement of failure, acknowledgement that a 4-year-old child had been failed by more than just the people convicted in court. And yet within that pain, there was resolve. Resolve to remember Serenity McKinney not only as a victim, but as a child who mattered. Resolve to keep her name visible. Resolve to demand better. As memorial candles burned down and the crowd slowly dispersed, one thing became clear. Serenity McKinney's story did not end with sentencing. It became a warning, a reminder, and a call to action. As the grief settled, another conversation began to grow. Quieter, but just as urgent. It centered on a single, difficult question. Could Serenity McKinney's death have been prevented? In the weeks following sentencing, public attention turned towards systems designed to protect children, especially Child Protective Services and other oversight agencies. Family members and community advocates began asking whether there had been earlier opportunities to intervene before Serenity disappeared. Local journalism explored those concerns carefully. Reporters reviewed what could be confirmed publicly and made clear what could not. In Kentucky, records involving minors, especially those connected to child welfare investigations, are often sealed by law.
That means details about specific CPS reports, internal decisions, or investigations involving Serenity McKinney are not fully accessible to the public. As a result, journalists could not definitively confirm the full scope of any prior CPS involvement. What was reported, however, was that questions were raised by family members, advocates, and members of the public about whether warning signs had been missed or whether earlier reports could have changed the outcome. Some relatives publicly stated that Serenity lived outside of formal systems that typically trigger oversight. She was not enrolled in school. She was not attending daycare. There were no routine wellness checks required by teachers, counselors, or mandated reporters who might have noticed her absence. That lack of visibility became a central issue. Without regular contact with institutions, Serenity McKinney's well-being depended almost entirely on the adults in her private life, particularly Catherine Abby McKinney, who was responsible for her care during the period after December 2020. Public commenters and advocates pointed out that this is often where children are most vulnerable, not because systems don't exist, but because they never get the chance to activate. Journalists also noted that while CPS agencies receive thousands of calls each year, the public rarely sees what happens after a report is made. Investigations may be opened, closed, or deemed unsubstantiated, all without details ever becoming public. In Serenity McKinney's case, officials did not release information confirming or denying specific prior reports, citing confidentiality laws. That silence frustrated many. But reporters were careful to emphasize an important distinction. The absence of public records does not confirm the absence of concern. It confirms only the limits of what can legally be disclosed. Family members, speaking cautiously, expressed pain over not knowing whether anything more could have been done. Some said they trusted that Serenity was safe because they believed systems existed to catch danger when families failed. The case forced many to confront an uncomfortable truth. Child protection systems are often reactive, not proactive. They depend on visibility. They depend on reports. They depend on adults noticing and acting. When a child disappears quietly, without school attendance or public oversight, the system may never even know the child exists. Advocacy groups used Serenity McKinney's case to call for broader reforms, including improved tracking for children outside traditional schooling, better communication between agencies, and more accessible ways for concerned relatives to raise alarms without fear of overstepping. What they did not do, and what responsible journalism avoided, was speculating about sealed records or assigning blame without evidence. Because while the questions are necessary, speculation is not justice. What remains undeniable is this: Serenity McKinney vanished for more than a year without intervention, and whether through family silence, systemic gaps, or a combination of both, that failure had irreversible consequences. The case left behind not just grief, but responsibility. Responsibility to ask hard questions, responsibility to improve systems, responsibility to ensure that no child becomes invisible again. By the time Serenity McKinney's remains were discovered, investigators were working against one of the greatest obstacles in criminal investigation: time. More than a year had passed between the last confirmed sighting of Serenity in December 2020 and the recovery of her remains in February 2022. That gap shaped every forensic and investigative decision that followed. When the suitcase was found in the wooded area near the Bullitt-Jefferson County line, the site was immediately treated as a controlled crime scene.
Investigators documented the location, preserved the surrounding area, and carefully secured the suitcase and its contents to maintain chain of custody, the documented process that ensures evidence remains intact and uncontaminated from discovery to courtroom. Chain of custody is critical in cases like this. Every person who handles evidence is logged. Every transfer is recorded, because when a case reaches court, the defense can, and often will, challenge whether evidence was altered, mishandled, or compromised. In Serenity McKinney's case, the suitcase itself became a central piece of evidence, not because of speculation, but because of what it objectively demonstrated. The suitcase, combined with plastic wrapping, indicated post-death concealment. That fact alone helped investigators and prosecutors establish intent to hide a body, which directly supported charges such as abuse of a corpse and tampering with physical evidence. The autopsy findings further shaped the case. While the Bullitt County medical examiner could not determine an exact cause of death, the documented injuries, including fractures to Serenity's right wrist and right leg, along with the manner in which her body was concealed, allowed investigators to classify the death as consistent with homicide. In long-delayed cases, forensic timelines are often reconstructed using a combination of methods rather than a single definitive test. Investigators rely on last confirmed sightings, witness statements, digital records such as phone data, patterns of behavior before and after disappearance, and admissions or statements made during interviews. Because decomposition limits what science alone can answer, context becomes evidence. In Serenity McKinney's case, that context included the absence of sightings after December 2020, conflicting explanations about her whereabouts, and the actions taken to conceal her remains. This is where investigative work and forensic science intersect. Forensic experts often explain that when a body is discovered long after death, investigators focus less on the exact moment of death and more on human behavior surrounding the death. What people did afterward or failed to do can be just as revealing as physical injuries. Police interviews played a crucial role. Statements from Catherine Abby McKinney and Dakota Hugh Hill were evaluated alongside evidence, timelines, and later admissions. Investigators looked for discrepancies, changes in wording, shifts in dates, explanations that no longer aligned with known facts. In some cases, jailhouse communications or recorded calls can also become evidence, offering insight into a suspect's mindset after arrest. While specific details of such communications are often not made public, their existence is a standard part of modern investigations and plea negotiations. What ultimately strengthened this case was not a single forensic breakthrough, but the convergence of evidence: the location of the remains, the method of concealment, the autopsy findings, the delayed report, the guilty pleas. Each element reinforced the others, and that convergence allowed prosecutors to move forward with confidence, even without a pinpointed cause of death. For the public, Serenity McKinney's case became a sobering example of how investigations must adapt when time erases clarity. It showed how justice is sometimes built not from one dramatic discovery, but from patient reconstruction, piece by piece. And it underscored a difficult truth: when a child disappears quietly, every day matters. Because time does not just steal answers, it steals chances. Serenity McKinney was 4 years old. That is the fact that sits at the center of everything you've just heard. Before the investigations, before the courtrooms, before the headlines and vigils, Serenity McKinney was a child, small, quiet, and entirely dependent on the adults around her to protect her. Her life did not unfold in public spaces where warning signs are easily seen. She was not in school. She was not surrounded by systems designed to notice absence. Her world existed largely behind closed doors, where trust replaced oversight, and where silence was mistaken for safety. The story of Serenity McKinney began with a holiday gathering in December 2020, when family members last saw her alive. It continued through more than a year of unanswered questions, until her extended family made the decision to call authorities in January 2022. What followed was an investigation shaped by time already lost, a search that quickly became a recovery, a missing child case that became a homicide investigation, a truth uncovered in a wooded area near the Bullitt-Jefferson County line. The discovery of Serenity's remains, concealed in a suitcase, wrapped in plastic, marked a moment that changed everything. From that point forward, there was no longer uncertainty about whether Serenity had vanished, only the responsibility of determining who had failed her and how. The legal process brought that responsibility into focus. Dakota Hugh Hill pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Catherine Abby McKinney, Serenity's mother, pleaded guilty to manslaughter and related charges and was sentenced to 12 years. Those sentences closed the criminal case. But they did not close the conversation, because Serenity McKinney's story leaves behind questions that no courtroom can fully answer. Questions about how a child can disappear for over a year without intervention. Questions about visibility, accountability, and the limits of systems designed to protect the most vulnerable. Questions about what happens when a child exists outside the structures that are meant to notice when something is wrong. Serenity's father, David Roller, spoke not just for himself, but for every parent who has trusted that their child was safe. His words echoed what many families feel after tragedies like this, that justice, while necessary, is never enough to fill the absence left behind. Across Shelby County, Serenity McKinney's name became more than a headline. It became a reminder. A reminder that children do not need to be loud to matter. A reminder that silence is not safety. A reminder that responsibility does not end with biology. It begins with care. For families who have been affected by violence, neglect, or loss, Serenity's story is painfully familiar. And for those families, support matters, community matters, speaking up matters. If you or someone you know is concerned about a child's safety, reach out to local child welfare organizations, trusted hotlines, or authorities in your area. Early action can change outcomes, and silence can cost lives. As we end this story, we want to hear from you. What do you think communities should do differently to protect vulnerable children? Where do you believe the biggest gaps exist, and how can they be closed? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like Serenity McKinney's matter to you, if you believe these cases deserve to be told with care, depth, and respect, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories. Because remembering Serenity means more than knowing her name. It means refusing to let children like her disappear unnoticed ever again. Thank you for watching.